Okay, let's dive right into this. Have you ever actually stopped to think about the sheer complexity of the human body as a three-dimensional space? I mean, it's basically a giant puzzle. To truly understand our anatomy, we face this absolutely fascinating, almost architectural challenge. We have to figure out how to translate a deeply intricate, layered 3D structure into flat 2D maps that we can actually study and diagnose. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to unpack exactly how medical map makers pull this off. We'll be focusing specifically on body planes and the all-important transverse cut.
So imagine for a second that you're a surgeon, or an anatomist or a radiologist. How on earth do you map the human body in 3D without getting completely lost in this wild architecture of organs and vessels and bones? Well, if a patient tells you they have a pain above the stomach, that description is entirely relative, right? It literally changes depending on whether the patient is standing up, lying flat, or sitting down. So we need a standardized grid, a completely reliable way to pinpoint exact locations inside the human body so that medical professionals everywhere are speaking the exact same spatial language.
And that entire grid starts right here, with what we call the anatomical position. Think of this as the North Star of human anatomy. It is the universal baseline. Before any virtual or physical cuts are made into the body, anatomists have to standardize the map. It involves a person standing upright, feet shoulder width and parallel, arms down at the sides, with palms and toes facing straight forward. And why is this absolutely crucial? Because no matter if a patient on the operating table is lying face up, which, by the way, we call supine, or lying face down, which is prone, this standard position is the universal mental starting point. Every single directional term we use assumes the body's in this exact specific stance.
Okay, so once we have our North Star, how do we actually navigate all this space? Well, we use a mapmaker's approach. To translate a massive 3D volume into readable 2D surfaces, anatomists use what we call planes. Think of these planes as imaginary flat surfaces, kind of like perfectly flat panes of glass, that just pass directly through the body. By slicing the body along these invisible glass panes, we create a standardized way to look inside, slice by slice. And we can do this without losing our spatial awareness or distorting how all these different organs relate to each other. And this brilliantly illustrates the big three. There are three major planes that create this grid. First, you've got the sagittal plane, sometimes called the lateral plane, which drops vertically to divide the body into right and left sides. Then, there's the frontal, or coronal plane, dividing the front, which is the anterior, from the back, which is posterior. And finally, the transverse or axial plane, cutting horizontally into superior, meaning top, and inferior, meaning bottom. Having this larger context is super important because it sets the stage for our main focus today.
So, we are going to put the spotlight squarely on the transverse or axial plane. This is a strictly horizontal plane. If you really want to visualize it, think of it acting almost like the equator of the human body. Or actually, imagine that classic magician's illusion where a box is bisected straight across the middle. It cuts the structure into upper and lower parts. And structurally, it sits completely perpendicular to both the vertical sagittal and frontal planes we just looked at. It gives us this incredibly unique top-down or bottom-up view of the internal organs.
So the crucial point here is that anatomical terminology relies heavily on binary opposites to describe relationships along these planes. When we're talking about the transverse plane, we are always pairing it with two directional terms: superior, which is also known as cranial, and inferior, also known as caudal. Superior describes a position that's above, closer to the head end of the body, or just simply higher than another part. Inferior is the exact opposite. It's a position below, toward the feet, or lower than another structure.
Let's lock this in with some real-world anatomy. When we use the transverse plane as a reference, we can map the exact relationships between body parts. For example, the orbits, your eyes, are superior to the oris, your mouth. Deep inside the chest cavity, the heart is superior to the diaphragm, which is that big dome-shaped muscle separating your chest from your abdomen. Conversely, if we look downwards, the pelvis is inferior to the abdomen. And the foot, well, that's firmly classified as part of the inferior extremity. It's this beautifully precise language that literally leaves no room for clinical confusion.
Let's move on and see how this builds from a concept into a physical tool. We're transitioning from this invisible plane to a cross-section. A cross-section is the actual, tangible, two-dimensional surface or image that's produced when you cut a three-dimensional organ or body horizontally right along that transverse plane. So if the transverse plane is the invisible conceptual blade, the cross-section is the actual surface revealed right after the cut is made. And this concept takes us on a pretty incredible journey.
going straight from the old-school dissection lab to the modern diagnostic clinic. Historically, early gross anatomy, which is the study of large, easily visible body parts, relied heavily on physical dissection. Anatomists and medical students had to physically separate and cut anatomical structures just to understand their transverse relationships. But today, the exact same principles apply, but we use non-invasive technology. We can achieve those precise horizontal transverse views on living, breathing patients without ever even lifting a scalpel. It's a real game changer.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how it directly bridges foundational anatomy with modern, life-saving medicine. Modern medical imaging devices enable clinicians to obtain virtual sections of living bodies, and of course, we call these scans. If you've ever had an MRI or a CT scan, you've benefited from this exact plane. You're looking directly at applied transverse anatomy. These incredible machines literally take a virtual transverse plane and bisect structures, like the brain, horizontally. This allows doctors to look down from a superior view, examining the tissue slice by horizontal slice. It really is the ultimate culmination of translating 3D space into 2D surfaces.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer, but hopefully this is just the beginning of your curiosity. Think about everything we've just uncovered regarding how we map 3D human architecture into 2D slices. Knowing what you know now about the transverse plane and those superior versus inferior directions, how do you think a doctor would navigate a virtual transverse scan of your brain from the top down? Like, what structures do you think they'd see first? Next time you or a loved one looks at a medical scan, remember the invisible glass planes that are making that view possible. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.